I'm Helena Cross, 52, and for the last 25 years I've been in the rooms where the most consequential intelligence decisions in American national security get made. For 3 decades, my father introduced me at every family gathering as his daughter who pushes paper for the Pentagon. Never my name, never my rank, never who I actually was. Then came a Tuesday in October, the day I took him to visit the building he'd always wanted to see. And what happened in that lobby, in front of the man who'd been erasing me for 30 years, changed something between us that I hadn't expected to survive long enough to change. Have you ever spent years making yourself smaller for someone you love, hoping they'd finally see you without the performance? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone in this. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stop making yourself small, if you've ever decided to just stand still and let the truth do the talking, hit that like button and subscribe. He has thought this for 30 years, or has chosen to think it, which is a different thing, and one I spent a long time trying to untangle. His name is Robert Cross. He served 26 years in the United States Army as an armor officer, retired as a colonel, and he has never quite recovered from the fact that his only daughter looked at everything he was and chose a different branch. He is not a bad man. He is a precise and stubborn man who built his entire sense of self around a very particular image of what service looks like, and I did not fit it. He has spent 3 decades managing that inconvenience by minimizing what I do. At family gatherings, Thanksgiving, Christmas, reunions, the endless rotation of other people's milestones, he introduces me as his daughter who pushes paper for the Pentagon, delivered with the fond dismissiveness of a man describing a hobby. I stopped correcting him years ago. I grew up a colonel's daughter, which means I grew up knowing how to pack a room in 40 minutes and what it sounded like when a man with authority walked through a door. We moved every few years, Fort Bragg, Fort Leavenworth, brief stations in between, and I became fluent in the grammar of military life before I could ride a bike without training wheels. I knew what each rank insignia meant before I knew how to multiply fractions. I could identify a soldier's branch by the color of his beret from across a parade field. I understood from a young age that our family's life had a shape and a reason, and that the shape and the reason were one and the same: my father's service. My mother, Dorothy, made each base house a home with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything. She hung curtains and learned the names of the neighbors' children and found the best grocery and the best diner within a week of arrival at every new posting. She had a gift for making temporary things feel permanent, which is its own kind of talent, and one I've thought about more as I've gotten older. My father made each new posting a matter of professional precision. He arrived knowing what he needed to accomplish and left having accomplished it. Between postings, he was entirely himself, decisive, demanding, and absolutely certain. I loved him without qualification when I was young. There was no reason not to. He was steady and capable and completely certain of himself, and to a child those qualities feel like safety. I can still picture him on a Saturday morning in 1981 at Fort Bragg in his dress greens, opening his shadow box on the dresser before a formal event. He walked me through each medal and ribbon, what it was, what it meant, who decided it mattered. I stood beside him in my socks and watched him handle each one with the same economy of motion, careful and proprietary, like a craftsman with his tools. He spoke about each one plainly: the action that earned it, the unit that bore witness, the reasoning behind the citation. There was no ceremony in his explanation. He was informative, not proud. He wore his record the way serious men wear serious things, because it's accurate, not because it's impressive. When I asked if girls could earn them, he said, if they earned them. Not yes, exactly, but not no. That was enough, at 8, to set a direction. By 14, I knew I wanted to serve. The branch was the disagreement. At dinner one night at Fort Leavenworth, I told him I was interested in the Naval Academy at Annapolis. He set down his fork. He did not raise his voice. Robert Cross never raised his voice at me, ever, which in some ways made it harder, because there was never anything to push against, no clear place where the anger lived. He explained, in the same measured register he used to explain everything, that the Army was where our family's service lived, that West Point was the standard for officer development, that the Navy was fine for some. He did not ask what drew me there, what I'd been reading, what I'd been thinking about, what about the sea had caught in me the way the Army had caught in him. He didn't ask. I didn't tell him. That became the shape of our conversations for the next decade. Him not asking, me not offering, and the silence between us filling with assumptions that neither of us had the language to correct. The night after that dinner, I put a small model of a destroyer on my bedroom shelf. It was plastic, painted gray, bought at a hobby shop in Leavenworth, with my own money. He saw it at some point in the following days and said nothing. His jaw tightened the way it did when he decided something wasn't worth addressing. The ship stayed on my shelf for 4 more years, through the move from Leavenworth to a posting in Virginia, and it came with me to Annapolis in the summer of 1991. In April of that year, I received my appointment to the Naval Academy. My mother made pot roast, Helena's favorite, and set the table with the good dishes. She toasted my future, and her eyes were bright, and she did not try to hide that they were bright. My father ate, asked about the curriculum, asked about the appointment process, did not raise his glass when Dorothy offered the toast. After dinner, he came to me in the hallway and told me quietly that he hoped I knew what I was choosing. I told him I did. He went to his study. I washed the dinner dishes alone, standing at the sink in the kitchen, in the way that I have done alone at sinks in many kitchens since. Thinking about the particular texture of his silences, trying to decide whether what I was feeling was grief. My commissioning at Annapolis in 1995 was a warm day in late May. The yard was full. My father attended in his army dress uniform, retired now, but he wore it precisely, every detail in order, because Robert Cross in a uniform meant something to Robert Cross regardless of the occasion's branch. He shook my hand when I received my ensign bars. All around us, fathers were hugging their daughters. His handshake was firm, and his grip held for exactly the right duration, and then released. He took one photograph, of me alone, not of us together, and then suggested we find somewhere for lunch. In the car, driving away from the academy, he said, "You'll do well if you work at it." I looked out the passenger window and said, "Thank you." I meant it. It was the last time he told me I'd do well at anything, and I have thought about it many times in the years since, whether he was withholding praise strategically, or whether he simply ran out of the vocabulary for it the moment I crossed into a world he hadn't given me permission to inhabit. He retired from the Army in the summer of 2007 after 26 years of service. The retirement ceremony at Fort Myer was attended by a handful of his peers, men who had served with him in Germany, in Korea, at various commands through the 90s. They were respectful. Several of them were genuinely fond of him. He looked at ease in a way I hadn't seen him look in years. He was returning to something permanent. The rank, the record, the shadow box, the clean full stop at the end of a sentence he'd been writing since 1981. He would be a colonel forever. That suited him. I attended in civilian clothes, no uniform, no insignia, nothing to complicate the afternoon. By then I was a commander. 05, promoted that same year. He hadn't asked what I was doing professionally in some time, so I hadn't offered it. He introduced me to his colleagues as his daughter, from D.C. They shook my hand pleasantly and moved on. I ate the catered lunch and helped Dorothy find her jacket and drove them home. What happened over the next several years was gradual and from the inside, nearly invisible. The shape of it was this. Robert had retired with a very strong self-concept and self-concepts that strong need to be actively maintained. He needed to be the most senior service member in any room he entered, and the surest way to guarantee that was to ensure that I wasn't, in the accounting of the room, a service member of any real consequence. And so the characterization evolved year by year, gathering the comfortable certainty of something repeated many times. She's in some kind of intelligence-adjacent thing. She works at a desk. She pushes paper for the Pentagon. Said always with the warmth of a man describing a daughter who had taken a different path and was doing fine on it. The first time I heard the exact phrase was Thanksgiving of 2009. A neighbor, a retired warrant officer who lived 2 houses down and came to Thanksgiving most years, asked about my work. My father said without pausing, without looking at me, "She pushes paper for the Pentagon." The warrant officer glanced at me. I smiled and passed the cranberry sauce. By 2009, I was a Navy captain, 06, the exact pay grade equivalent of Robert's terminal rank of colonel. I did not say this. I was still in the phase of believing that if I stayed patient and waited long enough, the right moment to explain would arrive and everything would correct itself naturally. The way you wait for a knot to loosen instead of picking at it. The right moment did not arrive. The pattern arrived instead. He said the same thing at Christmas of 2011, at a family reunion in 2013, at his sister's 70th birthday dinner in 2015. At every gathering where I came in civilian clothes and gave the same careful non-answer when relatives asked what I did. They had learned over the years to stop asking. The non-answer was polished enough by then that it didn't look like a non-answer, it just looked like a woman with a boring job. By 2015, I was a rear admiral, 2 stars, By 2018, I was a vice admiral, 3. And through all of it, through every promotion that required a ceremony I attended in a building my father had never set foot in, my father introduced me as his daughter, who pushed paper for the Pentagon, delivered in the same fondly dismissive register, and I kept smiling, and I kept passing whatever was on the table, and the right moment kept not arriving. In 2020, I was appointed director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. I took 2 days to decide whether to call home about it, and then called home. Dorothy answered, and I told her. She said it sounded important. I said it was. She asked if it was dangerous. I said no more than the rest of it. She said she was glad. Then Robert picked up the extension. They still had a landline, the only people I knew who did, and asked if the new position came with more travel. I said yes. He said, "Well, that's the desk life, I suppose." I thanked him for asking and hung up. My aide was in the hallway with a briefing book. I picked it up and started reading. That was the year I stopped expecting anything different from him. Not bitterly, I had run out of bitterness somewhere around 2015. Just factually. This is what it is. This is how he is. I know this now. In October of 2025, my mother turned 76 on a Tuesday. I had cleared my morning calendar for the occasion, no small thing in my role. The calendar of a DIA director does not clear easily, and clearing it for a family errand requires the kind of coordination that involves 3 people and 2 rescheduled meetings. I arranged it because I wanted to and because I had decided, sometime in the summer, that I was going to offer my father the thing he had privately wanted for years and never asked for, a visit to the Pentagon. He had been to Washington many times in his career. He had been to the old Army facilities scattered through the area, but he had never been inside the Pentagon, and I had watched him go quiet about it at enough dinner table conversations to know that it pulled at him. I didn't announce this plan in advance, I just arranged it. I drove out to their townhome in Arlington in civilian clothes, dark slacks, a navy blazer, my hair back, nothing that announced anything about me. I looked like what I wanted to look like that morning, a 52-year-old woman taking her elderly father to lunch. My father came out to the car in slacks and a button-down shirt, looking the way he always looked when he was attempting to appear relaxed, slightly rigid in the shoulders, jaw set at the angle that meant he was thinking about something he wasn't going to say. He got in and asked about the Beltway. I told him I'd taken surface streets and it hadn't been bad. He talked about an Army readiness report he'd read in a Veterans Affairs magazine that he found at his doctor's office. He did not ask about my work. I drove. The silence between us had been long enough and consistent enough that it no longer felt like silence. It felt like the ambient sound of our relationship, familiar and mostly comfortable. The visit was simple by design, lunch at the Pentagon cafeteria, then a walk through the public access corridor, perhaps a stop at the Hall of Heroes. His escort credentials were being processed upstairs by my aide, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Ortiz, who would bring the paperwork down and meet us at the front visitor's entrance. We would go through the main lobby because his guest pass required the standard check-in process. I thought nothing of this. I dressed deliberately without thinking about it. The blazer, the slacks, nothing identifying. I had wanted, for that particular morning, for it to just be the 2 of us. Not the 3 stars, not the directorship, not the rank structure that had separated us in one way or another since I was 22. Just lunch, just the 2 of us, or as close to it as we ever managed to get. The main visitors' lobby of the Pentagon is a large, busy space. Check-in desks, security lanes, a steady movement of people who work in the building and people coming to visit them. On a Tuesday morning in October, it was particularly backed up. A group of congressional staffers, a school tour that had arrived early, the usual accumulation of credentialed visitors whose paperwork was being processed at varying speeds by the desk staff. We joined the line. Lance Corporal Marcus Webb was at the front desk. He was processing visitor credentials with the efficient speed of someone who has a line longer than it should be, and is moving through it by pattern recognition alone. He was 22, maybe 23, with the focused forward attention of a young Marine who takes his post seriously. I stepped forward when the person ahead of me cleared. Webb didn't look up. He processed. In his peripheral vision, a middle-aged woman in a blazer, no lanyard visible, no credential in hand. His assessment was instant and probably accurate by his training. Civilian, unprocessed, wrong position in the queue. He waved me to the side. "Move over, lady. Move over. Civilians wait their turn." Then he reached past me without fully extending the gesture of it, a hand on my shoulder, a physical redirect, efficient and impersonal, the practiced motion of someone who has moved a lot of people through a space without fully engaging with them as people. He took the paperwork from the person behind me and continued. I heard my father before I looked at him. The sound was specific, low, brief, satisfied. the particular sound of a grin that has arrived unannounced. He was looking at me with the sideways expression I had been seeing since I was a child, the one that meant he had caught something he found confirming. He said it quietly, almost under his breath, the way he said things when he wanted to be heard, but wanted to be able to say later that he hadn't been making a point. "Guess you're not as important as you thought you were." I stayed quiet. I stood exactly where Webb had put me, which was slightly to the side of the main queue, and I did not move and did not speak and did not reach for any credential. I had spent 30 years being told, in one register or another, that I wasn't what I was. I had learned a long time ago that responding in those moments cost more than it returned, that the correction never landed the way you wanted it to, that the satisfaction was always smaller than the cost of spending the energy. So I stood. Webb's hand was still at my shoulder. The line moved around me. I waited. Then the executive elevator at the far end of the lobby opened. Vice Admiral Daniel Pike, the J3, Director of Operations for the Joint Staff. 3 stars on his collar, the man responsible for the operational planning and execution function of the entire joint military structure, stepped out. He had been trying to reach Ortiz for 11 minutes and had finally come down himself. He stepped into the lobby and his eyes moved across it with the practiced economy of someone who locates what he's looking for in rooms quickly and without theater. He found me. What happened to his posture in that moment was something I have seen many times over the years, the involuntary physical correction that occurs when a senior officer is recognized. His chin came up fractionally, his shoulders settled back and down. His gait changed, not slowed, but weighted differently. The purposeful deliberateness of a man approaching someone who deserves to be approached deliberately. He crossed the lobby. He stopped in front of me. He removed his cover with his left hand, and with his right hand, he executed a salute. Deep, formal, held for 2 full seconds, the kind you give when you want the salute to be unambiguous. "Ma'am, the Joint Chiefs are ready for you." SecDef moved the brief up an hour. The lobby went quiet in the way that large, busy spaces go quiet when something unexpected happens in the center of them. Not silent, the building was never silent, but the human ambient sound dimmed as awareness turned. Webb's hand left my shoulder. I watched the color leave his face in the particular staged way that color leaves a young person's face when they realize, all at once, the full dimensions of a mistake. My father's grin did not fade slowly. It did not transition into another expression. It simply stopped, like a light being switched off, and what was underneath it was something I could not immediately name. I returned Pike's salute with the precision of someone who has rendered and returned salutes 10,000 times in 25 years of service. I turned to Webb. My voice was the register it always is in professional settings, quiet, clear, no elevation and no edge, because there was genuinely no edge in me in that moment. I told him that the visitor on my escort ticket was my father, Robert Cross, a retired Army colonel, and that he would need a standard guest pass when Lieutenant Commander Ortiz came down with the formal paperwork. I asked him to process it when he had a moment. I thanked him. I thanked Pike and told him I would be upstairs in 4 minutes. I walked to the elevator. Robert followed, 2 steps behind me. I could feel the quality of his attention, without looking at it, the way you can feel the shape of a room change when everyone in it becomes aware of the same thing. He was watching me move through the lobby. He was watching the way the space around me organized itself differently now that he knew what the space knew. He was watching officers straighten as I passed, watching the desk staff hold themselves differently, watching a building of 30,000 people reflect back at him in small and unmistakable ways, the identity of the woman he had been introducing as a paper pusher for 3 decades. The elevator doors closed. We stood side by side in the small mirrored compartment, and the sounds of the lobby fell away, and he did not say a word. I pressed the button for the 4th floor and watched the numbers above the door begin to change. I had imagined a moment like this, in some form or another, across 30 years. I had imagined it with anger, with the particular cold satisfaction of a public correction, with the small, bright flare of being right in front of the person who insisted you were wrong. None of those imagined versions felt like what I actually felt in that elevator. What I felt was grief, clear, clean, specific grief. The kind that comes not from losing something, but from seeing, for the first time with full clarity, the exact shape of what you've been carrying and how long you've been carrying it, and how unnecessary most of it was. The Joint Chiefs brief ran 2 hours and 11 minutes. It was a consequential session, the kind where the room requires your complete attention and you give it, because the alternative is unacceptable. Robert waited on the fourth floor with his guest pass clipped to his lapel. Sarah Ortiz sat with him for the first hour, answered his questions. He asked 3: the square footage of the building, the number of employees, the floor on which the Joint Chiefs met, and brought him coffee, which he held without drinking for the better part of 20 minutes. She told me later that he spent most of the 2 hours watching the corridor. Officers moving through, some 2-star, one 3-star who passed without noticing him. He sat very still and watched them walk. When I came out of the briefing suite with my portfolio, I found him in the chair with the same straight-backed posture he'd had in the lobby. He stood when he saw me coming. He almost never stood for me. His body did it before his mind caught up with it, I think. Some old reflex, the recognition of rank or of something rank adjacent, something that had always been in him and was only now being aimed in the right direction. We drove to a restaurant near Arlington. We ordered, the food arrived. He finished half his sandwich. He set it down, looked at the plate, and then looked up. "How long have you been a vice admiral?" I told him. He sat with the arithmetic for a moment. 3 stars since 2018, which made 7 years, which meant before that, 2 stars, and before that, 1, and she passed my rank somewhere in the early 2010s. He didn't say any of this calculation out loud. He just did it, quietly, at a restaurant table, with half a club sandwich in front of him and the look of a man doing a sum that keeps coming out larger than he expected. He asked about the DIA appointment. 2020, I told him. Another long silence. He looked out the window. We were quiet for a while. I ate my soup. On the drive back to Arlington, on the interstate with the city spread out around us in the way it spreads out when the light is flat in October and neither pretty nor ugly, he said, "Your mother doesn't know either, does she?" It was not a question. He had already arrived at the answer. He was sharing it out loud, the way he shared conclusions, rather than asking for confirmation. I told him she knew I was in intelligence and had chosen not to push further. He said, "That's her way." He looked out the passenger window. When we pulled up to the townhome, he got out slowly. His knee has been bothering him for 2 years now, and he doesn't mention it, but I can see it in the way he moves, and walked up the path to the front door. He paused at the threshold. His back was to me. He stood there for a moment in the thin October light and said, "Happy birthday to your mother." Then he went inside. I sat in the running car in front of my parents' house for 4 minutes. I counted them. I was not crying. I was not angry. I was doing the thing I have always done when something large happens, turning it over carefully, looking at it from all sides, trying to understand what it is before deciding how to feel about it. What I was looking at was 30 years of a particular transaction. He reduced me so that he could remain large, and I absorbed the reduction so that we could remain connected, and neither of us had ever named this, because naming it would have required one of us to be brave in a direction neither of us had been trained for. I pulled away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, the lights in my parents' kitchen were on and warm. I drove. I did not go home for Thanksgiving that year. This was the first time I had missed it without a deployment as the reason, the first time I chose, consciously, not to go. I called Dorothy 2 days before. I told her work wouldn't release me, which was not entirely true, but also not entirely a lie. There are always things that need attention, always reasons to stay in Washington for any given weekend if you're looking for them. What I was actually doing was something I'd been a long time arriving at. I was deciding to stop buying my seat at the family table with my silence. Every year I had shown up and smiled and passed the cranberry sauce and let him introduce me as whatever he introduced me as, and I had told myself this was grace, or patience, or love. But grace that costs you something every time is not grace. It's a transaction. And I had decided, sitting with what happened in the Pentagon lobby, to stop transacting. I sent flowers and a card. Dorothy said, of course, and not to worry. Then at the end of the call, she said, "Your father asked if you were coming." I noted this without comment. He had asked. That was new. On the Sunday after Thanksgiving, the phone rang. Robert. Not Dorothy's voice first, and then him picking up, his voice, versed, on a Sunday afternoon, which had not happened since I was a midshipman calling home on duty nights. The call was brief and slightly awkward. He asked about the weather in Washington. I asked about his knee. We talked around a kind of nothing for 7 minutes. But he had picked up the phone and dialed my number and waited for it to ring. I filed this without comment and without showing him that I'd filed it, because with my father, marking a thing is the fastest way to make it stop happening. Around the same time, I had dinner with Priya Desai, a rear admiral and longtime colleague who is one of a small number of people who knows the full architecture of both my career and my family situation. I told her the lobby story over pasta and a glass of wine. She listened without interrupting, which is a quality I have always valued in her. When I finished, she asked, "What do you want from him?" It was the right question. I thought about it genuinely, not the practiced answer, the actual one. I said, "I don't know anymore. I think for a very long time I wanted his pride, his acknowledgement. Now I think I mostly want for it to stop costing me something every time I'm in the same room with him." She said, "Then stop paying." I told her I was working on it. The card arrived in mid-December. Plain envelope, his cramped handwriting on the front, no return address except his name. Robert Cross, Arlington, Virginia. I opened it at the kitchen counter. Inside, one line on the card. I looked up the DIA. You should have told me. No apology, no context, no closing beyond his name. Just that one sentence, specific and direct, his handwriting in blue ink. I read it 3 times standing at the counter. He had found an envelope. He had written a line. He had addressed it and stamped it and put it in a mailbox. Robert Cross, who had not written me a letter since I was at the academy. 7 words in blue ink, and a stamp, and the effort it took to do something he didn't know how to do. I put the card on my desk and went to bed, and decided it counted for something. What I didn't know until Dorothy called in late December was that things had been happening in Arlington that I hadn't been present to see. Robert had a Thursday lunch group at the VFW. A small rotation of retired officers, the kind of quiet, regular gathering that retired military men seemed to generate naturally, meeting over bad coffee and sandwiches to talk about what they'd done and what the services were doing now. Among them was a man named Harold Stokes, a retired Army lieutenant general, 2 full stars above Robert's terminal rank, who had been for years, through professional channels, aware of what I actually did. He had never brought this up with Robert. He was waiting. He was the kind of man, I've been told, who understood that some things land better when people arrive at them on their own. After the Pentagon visit, after Robert had done his arithmetic and sat with it for weeks sometime in November, after my commissioning photo had come out of the drawer where it had been for 20 years and been placed in a small frame on the right side of his desk, Harold called him. He said, with the careful precision of a man choosing his words, "I've been reading about the DIA director, your daughter." Robert didn't say much in response to this. Dorothy told me that when he hung up the phone, he sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes without moving. She made tea. She did not ask what was wrong. She understood him well enough to know that asking was not what was needed. The photo on his desk, it was the one he had taken at my commissioning in 1995. Of me alone, not of us. For 20 years it had been in a drawer. Now it was in a frame where he could see it when he sat down, which meant he saw it every day. Dorothy mentioned this to me in the late December call. Almost as an aside, she was talking about something else and mentioned it the way you mention something that seems small but is in fact the whole point. Through January, I was buried. The intelligence review cycle, an NSC briefing, the grinding pace of a directorship that does not pause for personal recalibration no matter what has changed in your life. I came home late most nights and lay in the dark and thought, for the first time in years, not about the intelligence picture, but about my father. About the particular wound I could see now that I'd had enough distance to look at it straight. The way his dismissal of me was its own inverted form of something he had passed on to me. The need for approval from someone whose approval matters enormously and arrives, when it arrives, very late. We had been circling the same thing from opposite directions our entire lives. I hadn't seen it until October. The voicemail came on a Tuesday in January. I was in a briefing. My aide texted, "Your father called." I listened to it that evening at my kitchen table, with a glass of water and nothing else in front of me. His voice was deliberate. Slower than I remembered, but deliberate. The voice of a man who has rehearsed something and is now saying it, knowing once it's said, he can't take it back. He said he had been thinking about what I did. He said he didn't know how to say what he wanted to say. A pause, long enough that I thought the recording had cut off. Then, "You outrank me. You've outranked me for a long time." And the recording ended. No goodbye. Just those words, and then the tone. I played it twice. He had not apologized. He had not said he was proud of me. He had said the plain mathematical fact of the matter. She outranks me, and she has for a long time in the one currency he had always respected and wielded. Rank, stated clearly without embellishment. For Robert Cross, who does not admit things, who does not surrender ground without a reason he can name, those 5 words cost everything available to him. I understood this about him completely. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after the second listen, and something in me that had been held tense for 30 years released, not all at once, not dramatically, but perceptibly. like pressure equalizing through a wall that had been holding it in. I had built everything I was anyway. The disapproval had not stopped me. It had not slowed me. It had perhaps even sharpened me, turned me into someone who did not need permission to believe in her own work. I had found my footing long before he offered his, and now he was offering it, in the only language he had. I decided to let it mean something. I called him back on a Saturday morning in February. He answered on the second ring. We talked for 45 minutes, the longest we'd spoken in any format since I was calling home from the academy on Sunday evenings. It was a real conversation in a way our phone calls had not been real for decades. He asked what the DIA actually does. I told him, we produce intelligence for the Department of Defense, serve as the primary military intelligence agency, maintain the Defense Human Service, produce the Defense Intelligence Assessment that informs the President's daily brief. He asked how many people I oversee. I told him, it's a large organization, spread across multiple facilities. He asked about the relationship between the DIA and the other intelligence community members. I explained the architecture in plain terms. He was taking it in, genuinely. I could hear it, the particular quality of attention that comes when someone stops managing a conversation and starts actually listening to it. He asked about the Joint Chiefs brief cycle. I explained. He was quiet for a moment. Then, and you've been doing this since when exactly? I told him the progression, the billets, the promotions, the appointments, the timeline. He didn't interrupt. He sat with it. He brought up Harold Stokes, said Harold had known for years. I told him I'd never directly briefed Harold on my career, but that my positions weren't classified from everyone in the community, just unannounced to family. I said, I never thought I needed to explain myself to you. I thought it would just become apparent at some point. I thought you'd look it up or someone would mention it. A pause. Then he said, that was my fault. Quietly, evenly, the way he said everything. 4 words, each one precisely what it cost him to say. I said, it was a long time ago. He said, yes, it was. And we moved on. We agreed on dinner in March. No occasion, just dinner. He suggested Saturday. I said I'd bring wine. He told me his doctor had him off wine, blood pressure. I said I'd bring sparkling water. He laughed. It was a short, surprise sound, warm, in the way I had forgotten his laugh could be. And I hadn't heard it in so long that it landed like something recovered from a long time lost. I drove to Arlington on a Saturday in March. He was watching for the car. He opened the door before I rang, which meant he'd been near the window. He shook my hand at the door, the firm grip that was always his greeting for me. Then he paused, and he hugged me. Both arms, real pressure, held for a count that was longer than it needed to just be polite. The last time he had hugged me, I was 18 and leaving for Annapolis, and that one had been brief. This one held. Dorothy was in the kitchen, making sounds at something that didn't need to be made. Sounds at. He smelled like the same aftershave from my entire childhood. Bay rum, sharp and warm. That smell had meant safety to me before everything got complicated, before the Naval Academy and the 20 years of silence and the pushing paper introductions. Standing in his doorway, in March, it meant it again. Briefly, unmistakably, it meant it again. After dinner, we stood on the front porch, in the cold, just the two of us looking at the street. He asked whether I thought about retiring. I told him I was not done yet. He nodded, said good. Then he said, your grandfather never thought I'd make colonel. He figured I'd wash out at captain. He came around eventually. People do if you wait long enough. He was looking at the street, not at me. I understood what he was offering. It wasn't a clean apology. It was Robert Cross telling me in the only language he had, the only framework he trusted, that he knew he had been wrong and that he was trying to say so without the words for saying so. I found I could receive it. I hadn't been sure until that moment on the porch that I could. April came quickly. My work did not slow for what had changed between us, and I didn't ask it to. The intelligence cycle moves on its own clock, indifferent to personal recalibration, and the work is what the work is. I briefed the NSC, I attended allied partner sessions. I navigated the interagency with the particular patience it requires. My days were full in the way they had always been full. What was different was internal and mostly quiet. I had spent 30 years with some portion of my attention aimed at the question of my father's regard, compensating for its absence the way you compensate, without thinking about it, for a physical imbalance. You don't notice you've been doing it until the thing doing the compensating stops needing to. On a February Saturday, on a 45-minute phone call, something in that mechanism ran down. I felt the quiet where the noise had been, and the quiet was not empty. It was just quiet. At a formal dinner at the chairman's residence in April, I was at the head table. introduced by name and title to a group of senior Allied military officials visiting from 5 countries. I accepted the introduction with the practiced ease of someone who no longer counts these moments as milestones. They are coordinates, simply the location of where I currently work. I thought of my father briefly, without bitterness, without the old sharp satisfaction of imagining him here. Just, he would recognize this room now. He has been in rooms like it, different branch, different decades, different particular decisions, and he would understand its grammar. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough. Priya Desai was at the same dinner. We had 20 minutes together between courses. I told her about the March dinner, the hug, the porch conversation. Your grandfather never thought I'd make colonel. She listened, then she asked, "What do you feel now, when you think about him?" I considered it honestly, the way she always made me consider things honestly. I said, affection, which had surprised me. I had expected vindication or relief or the particular clean pleasure of being right. But what I actually found when I looked was fondness. Warm, complicated fondness, even for the difficult parts, because the difficult parts had made me extraordinarily good at a very consequential job, and I did not want to pretend otherwise. Priya said that was generous. I said I had had a lot of time to practice generosity in his direction. I learned through my aide in April that Lance Corporal Webb had been selected for the officer candidate pipeline. I considered this without particular surprise. The young men and women who make a significant error and then respond to it immediately, in writing, with precision and without deflection, tend to be the same ones who develop into very capable officers. I dictated 2 lines of congratulations through official channels, unsigned, no context. He would have no idea who sent them. That was fine by me. Dorothy called mid-April with her regular call, covering the state of the azaleas and her sister's hip and what she'd been reading. Near the end, she mentioned that Robert had been going to a new lunch group, smaller than the VFW gathering, 4 or 5 men meeting at a diner a few miles from the house. She said he came home from those lunches lighter. I said I was glad. She said, "I don't need to know what happened between you and your father in October. But thank you." Late on a Friday in early May, I was at my desk with a review in front of me and the building gone quiet around me, the particular deep quiet of a large federal facility late on a Friday when the offices have cleared out. On my desk was the commissioning photo from Annapolis, 1995, moved from a drawer a few weeks earlier, not as a statement, just because it seemed like the right time to have it out where I could see it. My father in the photograph, slightly apart, formal, not touching me. I had spent years looking at that photograph and seeing only the distance, the inches between us, the absence of his hand on my shoulder, the way he'd arranged himself in the frame as though proximity were optional. That Friday evening, I looked at it and saw something else. I saw a man who did not know how to stand next to his daughter and drove to Annapolis in May heat and stood there anyway, in his retired uniform, precise about everything, holding a camera. He showed up. He was there. That had taken something too. I just hadn't known what it cost him until I was old enough to have things of my own that cost me something. On a Saturday in late April, I drove to Arlington with no plan. No birthday, no occasion, no holiday to give it shape. I pulled up to the townhome and sent my mother a text. "In the neighborhood. Eating?" She replied in less than a minute with, "Tomatoes are in." I parked and walked to the back gate. My father was in the garden, flannel shirt, canvas trousers gone dark at the knee where he'd been kneeling, a trowel in his hand, crouched over a row of tomato plants in the way that requires, at 78, more deliberation than it did at 48. He heard the gate and looked up over the fence. He said, "You're early." I said, "Traffic was light." We both knew traffic on the Beltway is never light on a Saturday morning. He held the gate and I went in. He was growing tomatoes. My father, who had spent 26 years commanding tanks, who had spent 20 more years telling everyone his daughter pushed paper for the Pentagon, who had never, in any iteration of himself I had known, appeared to be a gardening man, was crouched in a small suburban garden with a trowel in the April sun, growing tomatoes, and he looked completely at peace. Not stoic, not managing something, not performing the competence that was usually his resting state. At peace. I had not known that look was in him. It was something I hadn't known to look for. Dorothy made lunch. Soup from whatever was in the refrigerator, bread she'd made earlier that week, the easy meal of people who have been feeding each other across a long marriage and don't need to be elaborate about it. The 3 of us sat at the kitchen table. Nobody talked about the Pentagon. Nobody talked about rank or branch or the Army or the Navy or the choices any of us had made about either. We talked about the garden, what he was growing, whether the tomatoes would come in before the first frost, whether the front yard azaleas were going to be any good this year. We talked about Dorothy's sister's hip and how the recovery was going. We talked about a documentary Robert had watched on the Pacific Campaign in World War II, which he said was mostly accurate, with some caveats. I told a story about an interagency meeting from the previous week, stripped of everything classified and shaped into something that was, in its bureaucratic absurdity, genuinely funny. He laughed, the same warm sound from the February phone call, surprised in itself, like something that kept being discovered. Dorothy caught my eye across the table and said nothing, which is its own language between women who love the same difficult man. This was the lunch we were supposed to have in October. I could see it clearly, sitting there, the simple version of that Tuesday. The one that would have happened if we'd been able to just be the people we were at this table. Soup and bread, no agenda, nothing to prove. Just the three of us in the middle of an ordinary Saturday, which turned out to be enough, which had always been enough. When I got up to leave, he walked me to my car, not to the doorstep, to the car itself at the curb. He stood beside me while I unlocked it and said that he'd been trying to write me a letter. I told him he didn't have to. He said he thought he did. I said okay. He nodded once, the nod that means the matter is settled. I drove away. The letter arrived 10 days later, 2 pages in his handwriting, the cramped, deliberate, leftward-leaning strokes of a man who formed the letters the same way he formed them in 1965 and never updated the habit. I stood at the kitchen counter in the morning and read it straight through, then stood there for a moment and then read it again. He did not say he was sorry. He does not have that word available to him in that particular configuration, and I have known this about him my entire life. And I had stopped needing him to find it somewhere in February. He said he was wrong about the Navy. He said he was wrong about her desk job. He said that the day he stood in the lobby of the Pentagon and watched 3-star officers adjust themselves around his daughter was the first time he understood that she had not just matched him. She had gone somewhere he could not follow, and that he had spent a very long time confusing that distance for disrespect when it was, all along, a different kind of greatness. He signed it, Love, Dad. The first time he had used that closing in a letter to me in at least 25 years. Possibly longer. I read those 2 words 3 times. I folded the letter along its original creases and carried it to the small desk in my study at home. Not my office desk at work. Not in the same drawer as the classified materials and the briefing books, but the personal desk in the room where I keep my mother's birthday cards and my Annapolis ring and the things that belong to the version of me that is not the director of anything. I put the letter in the drawer. I made a second cup of coffee and stood at the window and looked at the city. I have spent the last 25 years working in the parts of American national security that don't hold press conferences and don't appear in any public record. I have briefed presidents and their senior advisors. I have been in rooms that don't officially exist. I have been doing this, in some form or another, since I was 22 years old, standing on a parade ground in Annapolis, with new ensign bars on my collar, and my father standing slightly apart from me. Formal, not touching me, holding a camera with 1 photograph left on it. I never wanted to surpass him. I need that to be understood. I never wanted to prove anything to him or to anyone else. Not to the lance corporal at the desk, not to the room that went quiet, not to any version of my father across any version of his expectations. I wanted what every child wants from the parent they chose to admire, to be seen, to have the person who knew you before you were anyone look at who you became and say, simply, yes, that's you, I recognize you. It took 30 years, and it took a Marine in a lobby and a voicemail on a January evening and 2 pages of cramped handwriting mailed to my house. But he said it in the only language he had. And I believed him. I believe him still. I had found my footing long before he offered his. But I am glad, standing here at this window with the city going about its Saturday morning below me, that he finally did. Additional content to be integrated. The thing about my father's silences was that they were never empty. They had texture. There was the silence that meant approval, rare and brief, a nod, a slight release of the set of his shoulders. There was the silence that meant disapproval, which was longer and carried a particular quality of stillness that I learned to read by the time I was 10. And there was the silence that meant he had decided the topic was beneath engagement, which was the silence he used most often with me in the years after Annapolis. That last one was the hardest to absorb, not because it was hostile, but because it was indifferent. Hostility at least acknowledges that the other person is there. Indifference is its own form of erasure. What I understand now and did not understand until I was much older is that the indifference was not really indifference at all. It was the outward form of something much more anxious, a man who had built his entire identity around a particular kind of greatness and was frightened, deeply frightened, by the possibility that someone he loved had found a different kind. He couldn't acknowledge my success without renegotiating his own. And renegotiating himself was something Robert Cross did not know how to do. I think about this often now. Not with anger. The anger burned out a long time ago. Somewhere in the mid-2000s, when I was on my 4th or 5th deployment in a role that didn't officially exist, and I realized that I had stopped waiting for his approval sometime without noticing the exact moment. What I think about it with is something closer to compassion, which took longer to arrive and cost more than the anger did, but sits lighter. The other thing about those years, the long middle of my career, from captain through the flag ranks, was that my father's dismissal of my work existed alongside the genuine weight of what I was doing. I was not pushing paper. I was producing intelligence that shaped decisions at the highest levels of American national security. I was running operations and building systems and managing information that people's lives depended on getting right. And every time I came home for a holiday and watched my father wave at me with the phrase, desk work, and turn back to his conversation, I was carrying the weight of those decisions in a way that had no outlet in his kitchen. I could not explain it. I had agreed, implicitly, not to. That gap between what I carried and what I could say is part of what made the silence between us so heavy. It wasn't just that he didn't know what I did, it was that I had agreed to let him not know, and the cost of that agreement accrued quietly, year by year, until it was very large. In the year after the Pentagon visit, going through the long, slow process of reconnecting with him, I came to understand something about myself through understanding something about him. He had needed me to be smaller than him in order to remain the Robert Cross he had always been. And I had, for 30 years, cooperated with that need, not out of weakness, but out of a species of love that prioritized his comfort over my own truth. What I had thought was patience was also self-erasure. What I had called grace was also silence. And silence, extended over decades, becomes a kind of lie by omission. Not about the facts were always available to anyone who looked, but about the relationship. About what I was willing to tolerate in order to stay in the room. The letter changed that. Not by correcting the past is what it was, and both of us know it, but by establishing, plainly, in his handwriting, that the version of me he had invented was wrong, and that he had finally looked at the actual version and seen it for what it was. That is what his letter said, underneath the careful language about the Navy and the desk job and the greatness he hadn't expected. It said, I see you. I should have looked sooner, but I see you now. That was enough. It was in the end, exactly enough. There is a particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with tears or with the sharp, bright pain of something acute. It accumulates slowly, over years, in the specific places where you kept hoping and were disappointed, and you carry it so long that it starts to feel like your natural weight, rather than something added. I carried that grief for 30 years in the form of my father's silence on the subject of who I was. And when the letter arrived, when I read it at the kitchen counter and then read it again, what I felt was not joy exactly, or relief exactly. It was the feeling of setting something very heavy down. The feeling of your hands being empty after they have held something for so long they had forgotten what it felt like to hold nothing. I put the letter in the drawer of my personal desk and I went to the window and I looked at the city and I thought about everything it had taken to get here. The deployments I couldn't describe, the promotions I didn't announce, the 30 years of holiday dinners and family reunions where I smiled and passed the dishes and let him introduce me as whatever he introduced me as, because the alternative would have cost too much and I wasn't ready to pay it. I thought about the 8-year-old girl in her socks, watching her father polish his medals on a Saturday morning in 1981. And I thought about the 52-year-old woman standing at this window in the morning light, and I thought, she got here. Whatever it cost, she got here. And the man who couldn't see her for 30 years has finally looked up. That is the story. That is all of it. The long, imperfect, entirely ordinary story of a father who didn't know how to love his daughter without feeling diminished by her, and a daughter who loved him enough to wait. And the Tuesday in October, in a government lobby, when the waiting finally ended. If you've ever been the person in your family who had to make yourself smaller to keep the peace, I see you. It's an exhausting way to live. And it is not forever. I've thought a lot about what I would have said to my 8-year-old self. Standing in her socks, watching her father polish his medals. The girl who decided right then that she wanted to serve, who chose the Navy, and who spent the next 4 decades building something her father didn't have a name for. I think I would have told her, keep going. The recognition will come late. But it will come. What my father wrote in that letter, that distance isn't always disrespect. That what he mistook for my pulling away was actually a different kind of greatness, I'll carry that for the rest of my life. Not because I needed it, but because he found it in himself to say it, and that tells me something about both of us. If you're the person in your family who has been quietly outgrowing what people expect of you, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if you've ever had to wait a very long time for someone to finally see you, you know what that wait costs. Drop it below. I read everyone. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit subscribe and the bell.